Okay, here we go. Mr. David Newstead was born in Brighton, England, but moved at a young age to the Texas coast. And aside from various perambulations around the world, has lived here most of his life. He has a BA in literature from the University of Houston and MS in biology from Texas A&M University Corpus Christi, where he studied fisheries and is currently working on a PhD in wildlife science at Texas A&M University Kingsville, focusing on red knots. He has worked for Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program for over 18 years as director of the Coastal Bird Program. His work focuses on conservation of natural resources, which means applying management action where we know it can make meaningful differences, and conducting research where we don't have the answers we need to make good decisions. When not at work, he enjoys surfing, fishing, and gardening. Please welcome Mr. Newstead.
Thanks. Can I hear me? You can hear me out there? Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction, Adriana, and thank you everybody for being here. This is crazy, a big packed house like this. It's like one of my first big auditorium gigs, so appreciate you showing up. Feel like the Rolling Stones or something. So as Adriana mentioned, I work for the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program. So we're a nonprofit that works locally. You may I imagine there's people from all over the country here. There's 27 or 28 national estuary programs in the country. And they're spread around mostly on the coast. There's also a Great Lakes Estuaries program. What the organization does that I work for, they do a lot of projects that are that basically work to try to understand and better manage natural resources. We have a big focus on water quality, water and sediment quality, wildlife and habitat, land conservation, maritime commerce and dredging. We have a lot of outreach and education programs as well. We own about 11,000 acres in the Nueces Delta nearby, and have an education program that's full-time out there and tries to bring through pretty much most of the students from nearby schools at some point in their curriculum. At some point while they're going through school, they're going to come through the Nueces Delta Preserve, and many of them are seeing the Delta and these this amazing ecosystem that's around them for the first time. So anyway, I'm really proud to work with that group. But within the group, I work for, I direct the Coastal Bird Program. And so we focus mainly on bird related stuff. So that means management of, for instance, all the birds that you're here to see, herons and egrets and terns and skimmers and things like that. They nest on these small islands out in the bays. So we're on a barrier island here, Mustang Island, and the mainland's over there. And in between, there's some sort of little small islands scattered about, and these birds nest out there, and they nest there because they need to be solitary, or they need to be away from a lot of disturbances and things like that, but they really group in there pretty tight. And anyway, that's essentially what they need. They need the ones that nest on the bare ground need bare ground. The ones that nest in brush need good brush. But overall, a lot of these species have been declining over the years. So we focus a lot of our attention on management of those species. I'm not going to be speaking as much about those tonight, mainly going to be speaking on plovers. I once found myself suddenly making the boast that this area, the Coastal Bend region, has the most plover species of anywhere in North America. And I went back and I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. So I'm going to try to defend that tonight. So I'm going to talk about, I'll talk a little bit about all of these different species that come through here. And we've done a lot of management or research on a handful of these species. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So to start with, I was thinking about this presentation in the context of, wow, I need to really sort of come out and introduce you guys to the amazing world of plovers. This is a really, really diverse group. In terms of their distribution. They range from the Arctic to the tropics. They're in just about every kind of habitat in the world, except forested habitats. They're really what ecologically you would call kind of a successful group of birds that really found a lot of small niches here and there, and they're pretty high diversity. So I wanted to think about something. I want to start off with something that would be really impressive. And that would be a really, sort of one of the most unique species. And the species I wanted to talk about, and this isn't one that is around here. It's actually called the Egyptian plover. I'm not making this up. This is an Egyptian plover, and this is the talk is sort of in the way. You can see the bird there in the crocodile's mouth. Why everybody's laughing here? This is serious. So the Egyptian plover was described by Herodotus in one of his early histories. So remember, Herodotus was an early Greek historian. There were really not many historians before him. So he sort of came along and said, I'm going to describe the world and everything that's happened before and everything that's in it up to this point. So he describes, among other things, this bird that he called Trochilus. It's called Trochilus in Greek. And basically what it would do is it was a symbiosis or like a really kind of like a mutualism. And you may have heard or seen videos of reef fish. So you see like groupers going on certain parts of reefs, going to cleaning stations. So they'll swim up, and there's sort of an area where I guess they've all kind of decided they're not going to eat each other. And these small little goby fish will come up and they'll go inside the mouth and they'll clean the gills. And basically the fish gets cleaned, and the big fish gets cleaned and the small fish get fed, and things move along. That's kind of a classic example of mutualism. So I was pretty shocked to find out about this Egyptian plover that is commonly known as the crocodile bird, because I hadn't heard a whole lot about it. So I was like, wow, I would have thought that I would have known about this bird. So anyway, I did a lot of research on this bird. And by research, I mean, I Googled it. And by a lot, I mean, I spent like a good 20 or 30 minutes on this yesterday morning to try to get to the bottom of what was going on here. So it turns out Herodotus, as I said, is sort of considered the father of history, and he's still sort of regarded as the father of history. He's one of the first people who really committed to paper something similar to what we akin to what we now know as history. So he had apparently seen this, or apparently witnessed it, or somehow knew that this bird happened and that it did this. It had this behavior. So he puts it down in writing. And then Aristotle comes along and he says, for crying out loud, he's the father of history. We got to believe him. It's in the history books, so it must be true. Next guy comes along is Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder gives it the thumbs up, says it must be true. Herodotus said it, he's father of history. So this thing keeps getting repeated, and it's been repeated to this day. You know, you're getting a Greek history lesson here as well. Later on, Plutarch comes along, and Plutarch basically gets really, really upset with Herodotus, says, you're more like the father of lies than the father of history. And this comes down to actually a personal beef that Plutarch had with Herodotus, because Herodotus wrote some things about Plutarch's people in the histories that he didn't necessarily like, he didn't agree with. So Plutarch actually writes a treatise, basically, it's called On the Malice of Herodotus. And it's considered, and I'm not making this part up, it's considered the earliest book review ever. So he basically just completely pans Herodotus for some of these things that he said. Anyway, it turns out that I was just fascinated by it because I Googled it and I found like all these websites that are basically saying the same thing. And it's even being used as an example in curriculum in different places, not in necessarily in like school curriculum, but just sort of like little online, trainings where you can learn a little bit about a natural history phenomenon or something like that. And I couldn't find anything to really contradict it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to check Google Scholar. And if you don't know what Google Scholar is, it is basically the outlet and the venue where peer-reviewed published literature is available. It works just the same as regular Google, except it's based on facts and not. So you can kind of regard it as the twin of a regular Google, but it's more like, well, it's not the evil twin. The regular one is kind of the evil twin. So this story basically gets repeated over time, and it started with probably Herodotus talking to somebody in a bar on the banks of the Nile River in the 5th century BC, and we're still talking about it today. So Plutarch throws the shade on this whole play. Well, it turns out that the Egyptian plover no longer occurs in Egypt. It is associated with riverbanks and sandbars of the Nile, but it no longer exists in Egypt. But denial. I got a free hat for anybody who will say it out loud. There you go. There you go. You win. You get a hat or a visor. The Nile ain't just a river in Egypt. It also extends into Chad and Ethiopia and Sudan. So the bird still does persist up there. But there's more. It's actually not a plover. Taxonomists have recently found that it's really not that closely related to the plovers. It's in another group called the coursers, which are somewhat related, but it's not even a plover. So now we know that this whole crocodile bird thing, there is an association, and researchers have noted that it does co-occur, but basically it'll go around the crocodiles when they're basking on the riverbanks, and they'll maybe feed and peck at little bugs around them, and occasionally maybe peck at at the sides of their mouths, but it's not a mutualism. They're not going in, and the crocodile's not dependent on it, and the bird's not dependent on the crocodile. So it's really not even a crocodile bird. But it is a bird. I can guarantee you it is a bird. So that's about where we are with this. And I apologize for wasting 5 minutes of your time on this. I spent 20 minutes figuring this out myself yesterday, and that's time that we will never get back. But I hope there's some lessons that we can take away from this. By the way, some of you may know that Pliny the Elder is actually a beer that's brewed by Russian River Brewing out in Santa Tomas or Santa Rosa, California, and it is the best IPA in the world. Never mind that guy. From this point on, I swear everything from now on is going to be credible information, fact-based information for you. Okay, so if I'm going to say something questionable, I'm going to put it in air quotes or attribute it to somebody else. Otherwise, we're sticking to the facts here. So plovers, like I said, they're a really interesting, diverse group. I'm talking today about the family Charadriidae, and all the plovers that we work on are basically two genuses. The Charadrius itself, this is a lot of the small plovers, and the pluvialis plovers, which are some of the larger ones. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but a lot of species around the world, most of them seem to be preferred to be near water. They're shorebirds, right? Well, not all shorebirds are really truly tied to the shore, to aquatic environments. Some are actually found in upland, desert, and grassland environments. But here's some general characteristics. They tend to have large eyes, basically for visual hunting of prey, as opposed to picking things, as opposed to probing very, very deeply. They're actually looking for clues of where food is on the ground and picking at it. So they have this kind of unique run, stop, pluck feeding method. So they're running along and then they stop, pluck, look around, run and do it again. And that's pretty standard with pretty much all the plovers. They generally have a straight bill, and by straight bill I mean straight this way, right? There's a lot of species of shorebirds that have a down curved bill or an up curved bill, a lot of different species, but except for the wry bill. And I'm not making, I know I've shot my credibility in the first 5 minutes of this, but This is actually a real species. It's a species that's found in New Zealand. It's called the wrybill, and it has a bent bill, which is always bent to the right. And there has been, there's been a number of hypotheses about why this bird would have evolved this unique bill. And probably the best hypotheses there are, one, that it nests also in these riverine environments where there's a lot of gravel. And in order to get a prey that's in heavy gravel, you've either got to be a big bird with a big heavy neck, or have a bent bill where you can kind of just go in sort of sideways. It's feasible. It's a pretty good hypothesis. It's hard to know exactly how this all transpired in terms of evolution. Another hypothesis is that there's been some evidence showing that they can actually consume what's called biofilm. And biofilm is a really, it's basically the mucilaginous goo that's on top of a tidal flat. You'll sometimes see on top of tidal flats. It kind of glistens a little bit. And what that is like a matrix of diatoms and things that the diatoms secrete that basically keeps that together. But it's actually very, very energetically rich. And shorebirds it's turning out that quite a lot of shorebirds are actually well adapted to feeding off of that. They'll just kind of run their bill along it. And it turns out to really fuel a lot of species migrations. So it's another possibility, but they tend to nest on the ground. Well, pretty much all of them. I think all of them do nest on the ground. Some have a little bit more of an elaborate nest. They'll dig a little depression and maybe line it with some shells or some grasses. But for the most part, they're just basically little small dimples in the ground. Their young are precocial, means that they as soon as they're hatched, they can start feeding for themselves. No more parental care really required as far as feeding, but the adults will generally stay with them for a while until they can kind of at least move around a little bit quicker and help them evade predation. You may be familiar. The killdeer is one species of plover, and probably anywhere anybody here is from, the killdeer are present, and you may know of these birds because of their unique their display. It's called the broken wing display. Basically, if you get near their nest, if their nest is here and you're over here, it'll fly over here and pretend it's got a broken wing. It's trying to draw you away from its nest. But the killdeer is not the only plover that does that. Actually, quite a few species do, and not just plovers as well. So what do they like? What do they don't like? Some of their turn-ons are basically ample habitat. This is true for just about any species, but in some cases they've got requirements for sort of a minimum amount of habitat. It's got to be reliable for a consistent period of time for whatever life history phase they're in, for nesting or for feeding or for wintering or whatever. And they need that to be fairly disturbance-free. They do prefer the ones that use beaches that we see on beaches out here, like piping plover and snowy plover. They need beaches that are natural. That means not constantly where a lot of people like to beautify beaches, or they call it beautifying, but they're actually scraping away all of the natural wrack and things that birds utilize and that they depend on. So they definitely do prefer beaches that are left alone. Things they do not like, of course, habitat loss. But habitat loss can come from direct things, like all of a sudden there's a big port or marina dredged into a tidal flat where they once were. But it can also be through degradation. Basically, maybe there's something that changes the hydrology, which has these ripple effects up the food chain, and results in the habitat no longer being of suitable quality. Again, they don't like groomed beaches, and they're not especially fond of large groups of people or vehicles or dogs. And I'll show you some of the research we've done on that in a little bit. They've got a variety of breeding systems. I put this bird up here. This is actually a red-breasted dotterel, and there are two species of red-breasted dotterel. They're both in New Zealand, and the southern one used to breed on the South Island of New Zealand. It's no longer there. It's only on one small island. It was basically extirpated from the island, from the South Island of New Zealand by stoats, which is a type of weasel that was brought in to control the rats that were also brought in. So New Zealand has this really big problem with invasive species and just making things worse by bringing in more, and they're trying to get a hold on that. And that species particularly numbers no more than a few hundred birds. So, but breeding systems are variable. Most of them are considered monogamous, and the asterisk there is that I would say that these birds are considered socially monogamous. And what's the difference, you might ask? Well, there's social monogamy, and then there's what's called genetic monogamy. And it's hard to really explain the difference, but we all know there's sort of like, sometimes we know a couple that get together and they have a child, and the child looks a lot like one of the parents, not a lot like the other one. Well, that's what's, there's something different going on there. What you're seeing socially is not necessarily what's going on in the genetics. So there's some funny business going on there. Sequential polyandry is a fancy term for basically a couple will get together, build a nest. The female obviously will lay the eggs, and then she'll ditch the male, go find another mate, and lay another nest, and then basically stay with that second male. And the first male will try to tend and rear that nest by themselves. And then there's another one called rapid multi-clutch. I'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about one of the plover species here. So pretty dramatic. I knew that would hit with this crowd. All right, everybody knows days of our life. So population sizes are sort of interesting in this group. There's a lot that are like this red-breasted dotterel are really teetering on the brink. There's only a few hundred of these birds left. But a lot of species of plovers have a naturally small, limited population of only a few hundred or a few thousand birds, like literally only a few thousand birds. That's probably half to maybe a little bit more. There's fewer than, say, 50,000 individuals. And that's, you know, the city of Corpus Christi is 200,000 or something like that. City of Port Aransas these days, I don't know what the population is, but the winter population is probably close to that. It's like it's that small. And then there's a number of species that are a little bit more widespread and common. They're kind of considered more cosmopolitan in terms of their habitat needs. Migration-wise, sorry, I can't see all that. But essentially, some do, some don't, and some do essentially a little. It really depends on the latitude. So birds that breed way in the Arctic, obviously they're not going to stay there for the non-breeding season. They only go up there briefly to breed, and then they spend the rest of the year elsewhere. All right. Okay. We can't keep that going. Okay. I don't think that's gonna keep trying to balance. All right, we did the best. I'll move it around actually as we need to. So anyway, like I said, they're considered successful because there's all these species, different areas. There's a lot of what are considered sort of near plovers, like the crocodile bird. Birds that are similar to, they probably evolved in a slightly different lineage going a little bit further back, but a really, really unique group of birds, including things here like some other dotterels and thick-knees. The one, if you're here for the cranes, that's called a crab plover. Actually, it's the most crane-like of the plovers. Eats fairly large crabs in South Asia. And then the guy in the middle at the bottom there is called the diademed sandpiper plover. So taxonomists really having a hard time even figuring out where this bird even fits. That bird's in the high Andes, in streams of the extremely high altitudes in Bolivia. And then this guy here at the bottom left, you'll notice this is the only species that looks at you with its left eye. All the other ones look at you with their right. I noticed this when I was picking through. I don't know if there's some automatic unspoken convention in the world about the way you're supposed to position these things. Obviously, you can just flip these things around, right? But when I was looking for these photos, I noticed that everything was pointed that way, except this guy. So something different about him. So as I mentioned, this is the ploveriest place in North America. There's 8 species that regularly rely on this area at some point in the year. 3 of these breed locally, 5 breed further north. And at this time, in the middle of the winter, you could potentially find 6 of these species in right now. 2 and then 2 other species, mostly are head further south to winter. So I'm going to run through real quick what these species are, just so that you can verify for me that I counted right, that there's 8 species. And I want you to look at the range of these birds. You'll notice that the plovers here, this bird does breed here on the flats, just out here, actually at Charlie's pasture, not but a mile from here. And it also breeds up in the, what are called sort of like the Playa Lakes region of the Panhandle and of Texas and parts of New Mexico in sort of desert areas. So it is sort of associated with wetlands there, but it's fairly dry up there. And then they will winter here as well. Wilson's plover, again, another one that commonly breeds here in Port Aransas and that we work on, and I'll talk some more. But interestingly, you can see that the purple there is considered year-round. And you say, oh, well, it's all over, it's in different places. Those are actually all considered, for the most part, they're considered different subspecies. So there's one in Cuba and the Antilles and parts of Colombia. There's another one on the west coast of South America, another one off Brazil, and a different subspecies up on the Pacific coast there in northwest Mexico. Semi-palmated plovers. This is probably one of the most wide-ranging. Sorry, let me see if I can move this. Winters all the way, breeds in the high Arctic, all across the Arctic, and winters all the way into South America. So it really goes quite a long way. Piping plovers, a lot of people know about these. So most of the piping plovers, basically there are essentially 2 subspecies, and there's these Great Lakes birds, which number only probably about 50 or 60 pairs. I'm not sure what the current estimate is. Very, very small number of pairs of birds. And then in what's called like the Northern Great Plains or Canadian prairies. And then there's also an Atlantic breeding subspecies. Pretty much all the birds, I'll explain this later, pretty much all the birds that we see here are from these 2 populations. Killdeer, look how broad that distribution is. Really, really spread all the way across year-round here. Just a very, very common and you might say successful bird. It's very adaptable. Find them in natural habitats. You also find them in parking lots, sometimes on gravel rooftops. They really do quite well. And then the 6th of the Estuaries plovers is the mountain plover. And this is a really unique one. I mentioned that not all these shorebirds require wetlands. And this is a bird that breeds in high grasslands in the Rockies, in Colorado up through Montana and Wyoming. And this is one that has that mating system I mentioned, the rapid multi-clutch. So essentially this bird probably evolved in that area and bred in that area and evolved its life history alongside bison herds moving across the landscape. I'm kind of hypothesizing here, but I would imagine that probably having rapid multi-clutch, which basically means a pair will mate and lay one nest, and then they'll mate, that same pair will mate again and they'll lay another nest, and then the male will take care of one, the female will take care of one. They're nearby, and it's sort of it would be a sort of sensible hedge against one being lost from trampling by buffalo, for instance. But again, like I said, I'm hypothesizing a little bit there. But it also spends the winter in parts of South Texas. So we just barely clip onto that one, and that gives us 8 species. The other 2 are these pluvialis ones, and one's the black-bellied plover, real high Arctic breeder, and then winters all the way into South America as well. And the golden plover, which looks very, very similar to it, but really this is really more of a grassland bird, and it winters down into the southern reaches of Argentina into Patagonia, and it's more associated with the grasslands than aquatic sites. That concludes the 8 plovers that we can potentially see here. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about a few things that we've been doing with these birds locally. A lot of this work requires banding. So we capture using various methods. We capture birds and band them. Sometimes we're putting unique leg flags or colored leg markers on them so we can identify them later. Sometimes we're putting on tracking devices so we can figure out what they're up to. These are not all plovers. There's a piping plover there in the top corner, but I just wanted to give you kind of a little bit of an illustration of some of the other birds that we've worked with and we've done tracking projects on. And these are all birds that we've captured or around here, basically on either Mustang or Padre Island or in Corpus Christi. So sanderling, let me move this again. Sanderling that we've tagged, been seen up in the Northeast US, been as far south as Peru. Skimmers, we've tagged these birds that are nesting here, and they're wintering on the Pacific coast of Central America. In a lot of cases, some stay here. A lot of the piping plovers we've marked, like I said, most of those originate from here. And then red knots, black-bellied plovers all the way up to the Arctic. And this guy, long-billed dowitcher, will nest up in the northwest of Alaska. But these we actually tracked a couple that went way over into northern Russia to nest and come back. So I'll talk a little bit about Wilson and snowy plover, a couple of the species that we talked about. And this is based mainly on two of probably some of the best plover sites in this part of the coast, and that's the Charlie's Pasture area, known as the Port-Aransas Nature Preserve at Charlie's Pasture, just like I said, just a mile over here, and Packery Flats, which is on the other end of Mustang Island by the entrance to Corpus Christi. And sorry, this. So these birds, like I said, these birds nest basically on the bare ground, and that ground is maintained bare by seasonal high tides that come in and flood out and basically salt the earth of vegetation and keep it sort of clear. So they've got to wait till those tides go down where they can nest and hopefully incubate for 27 or 28 days and hatch young that can escape the next high tide. The Wilson's plover's got this big honking bill here. They eat a lot of fiddler crabs. And we're banding them, in this case, with unique alphanumeric codes. That says K8, I think, if I'm reading it right. So we see that bird again. We don't have to recatch it. We can tell who it is. Snowy plovers tend to prefer more open areas for nesting. There's their egg set right there. A smaller bill, different tools for different jobs. They eat little small insects. And we're banding them with unique color bands. So we know who this individual is for where those colors are on the leg. I think Brooke, who helped me put this together, I went ahead and left it in here. They have precocial young, and they are objectively super cute. There's no disputing that. But we've been monitoring these birds for almost 10 years now, since 2014 at these two sites. And these are not actually made up numbers. It looks like, 25% and 50%, that's an estimate, but it is an actual, it is just very, very close to 25 and 50%. And that's successful hatches, how many nests were laid and how many of those hatched at least one egg. So it's a relatively, they're dispersed all across this habitat. It seems like a pretty big area, but they have little territories and they maintain distance from each other. So it doesn't look like a huge amount of nests, but it's actually quite a lot. Snowy plovers only breed here. They don't breed at Packery Flats for some reason. But they end up with an average of about 21 nests per season there. And I'll talk more about what we're doing with them there. Wilson's plover, something that we noticed about Wilson's plovers and something that had been noticed historically by Tony Amos, who I'll talk about later as well, is that a lot of these plovers will just tend to mass up around here, like in late July. And then this is all Wilson's plover here, except this willet who's photobombed right in the middle. But basically you see a ton of birds sort of showing up. There were, I think, 300 or so birds, Wilson's plovers in this group on this date. And they stay till early September, and then all of a sudden they're gone, like usually with one of the first north winds of the fall season. Doesn't even have to be that cold. The wind turns and they're just gone. And then suddenly they reappear in mid-March. So where are they going? We know that they're from range maps that they do occur further south in the Gulf, just across the border into Tamaulipas and Veracruz and towards the Yucatan. So that might seem like the most obvious thing, that they just go the shortest distance possible. But we didn't know that, and that bugged me. So we started a project. We used what's called a geolocator, and this is a device that records light levels. It doesn't record anything else but the light level and the time. So it doesn't record location. That has to be inferred from the amount of light that the device is recording. So if you move further north, then day length gets shorter. And if you move further west, then the timing of the signal of the sunrise and sunset shifts accordingly. So you have to use this data to kind of infer where the bird is on the land at any given time. And of course, you got to keep in mind that day length is changing all the time. The equinoxes get to be kind of problematic because day length and day and night length is pretty similar. But what we found out is that we recovered a few of these, and these birds went a lot farther than we realized that they would. They went all the way to Panama, and specifically they went on the Pacific coast of Panama. This is basically where they started. These are some migratory stops. Because of the timing of the equinox, we're not exactly sure. We can't say for certain where they were in this range, but the longitude difference is about right. Could have been down here, could have been up here. But they both wintered in Panama, and the one that actually was able to be tracked all the way back flew direct back to Texas in one flight. It took it about 2 days direct. Now, why I emphasized that subspecies difference before is that this wasn't known prior to us doing this. It was assumed that these birds, the Wilson's plovers on the Pacific coast, were of this subspecies that breeds in Northwest Mexico and elsewhere on the Pacific. Now, they do, but apparently now we know that for about 6 months of the year, there's both subspecies are present down there. So when we are asking questions about a certain population, we kind of need to know who we're talking about. If you were just looking and monitoring Wilson's plovers in Central America and you saw a decline, now all of a sudden you know this. Now you got to figure out, well, which ones are declining worse? You know, some could be actually be increasing while another group is declining. So this is some research that we've done some work on black-bellied plovers before with Smithsonian. This particular project is with a graduate student from Texas A&M University in Kingsville, and he tagged these birds. And we already know that these birds that are here, we know they're wintering here, we know where they breed. But in this case, the real question was how they get from here to there, because they've got they got several thousand kilometers they've got to go. And do they stop on the way? And what do they need as they stop along the way? What are they looking for? If you fly from here to Alberta, you will see that the landscape is entirely converted to agriculture or some sort of production. And that was historically habitat. that they may have been able to use. Well, they're having to use the landscape differently now. So this project is specifically aimed to try and understand what landscape features these birds are utilizing the most, which can help us prioritize conservation of those. So this is potentially never before seen, actually. So these red lines are birds that were trapped down here in the Corpus Christi area, and the blue ones are ones from a project where at Rockefeller Wildlife Refuge in Louisiana. As you can see, they kind of generally went more or less the same place in the end, up into the Arctic to breed. But this whole cluster here and everything in between is what's really of interest. And the GPS level data that we're getting from this project is going to allow that student to really hone in on what the important things are in that landscape. Why did it choose to stop here and not down here? But what it really emphasizes is the high reliance on the northern prairies, prairie pothole region of the U.S., and the what's called I think it's called the Missouri Coteau, basically the plains and grasslands of Saskatchewan and Alberta in Canada. Piping plovers. We've done quite a lot of things on piping plovers over the years. It's one of the listed endangered species. It's considered threatened here and occupies all of our beaches. So we've been conducting these beach surveys. They're relatively easy. When they're on the beach, they're relatively easy to survey. You just drive along and you see them. You pretty much don't miss any of them. If they're on the beach, then you can see them, and you document where they are and the number of people and vehicles and stuff as you go. Dogs and lemurs. We did have a lemur. We had to adjust our data sheet to add a lemur. It was on a leash, but we had to change our data sheet to add that to our data collection. Let me move this out of the way here. This is from some other work I'm not going to go into much from everything around. This is from up near Galveston. This is a piping plover. We were doing a radio telemetry project, and this is the one where you see the people out in the field with the antenna just waving it around, trying to figure out where a bird is or an animal. Is that kind of a project. And what you'll see, what I want you to notice is that this green spot is where we caught the bird. And then all these other points in here are places that it was seen in different months of the year. Gray ones are December, white's January, black. So it's kind of wandering around. And when it wanders around, it's all just hanging out with a whole bunch of plovers. We probably found it with 50 other plovers out here one day, or 100 plovers out here one day. But when it's on the beach, it's right here. It's always right here. There's a big cluster of points right here. There's probably 20 or 30 relocations of it, all in that same little spot. They're super territorial when they're on the beach. And that information really helps us go to the next step, which means now we can try to figure out how many birds are occupying this whole area based on how many birds we see repeatedly throughout surveys at different times of the year. So explain a little more about kind of how that works. Like I said, these are banded. A lot of work's been done on these birds, and so a lot of them have been banded with uniquely identifiable leg marks. Most of our birds come from Prairie Canada and mostly along the Missouri River and sandbars along the Missouri River, the alkali lakes, some from this small population here and a few others. But the colors on the legs will tell us where these birds are coming from. And then birds we've captured down here on the Texas coast are in red, have a red flag like this guy here. So some of you may be familiar with Tony, have been down here for a while. Tony was really a unique individual. He worked here at UTMSI, and he was an oceanographer. He was just sort of interested in everything. One of the really interesting things that he did is right when the Ixtoc oil spill was happening in Southern Gulf in the 70s, late 70s, he decided he would go and survey the beach. So he surveyed from right out here down to Access Road 2. And he said he was going to, survey it and do it do it until the oil arrived, get a baseline for what's there before the oil arrived, so he could see how things changed. So he did it, and then he decided he would do it every few days until the oil arrived, and then just keep on once the oil arrived, and then, you know, just sort of see how it played out. Well, he ends up doing this for this graph here goes through 2001. He ends up doing it until 2017, basically, until he passed away, unfortunately. So for about 40 years, he's got this incredible amount of data where he's been surveying the same stretch of beach, the same methodology. It's an incredible amount of data. But he had a really interesting way of thinking about things that's actually kind of helpful. Like I said, this is what he called his everything diagram. And going across this way, this is a histogram by a month of the number of piping plovers. You don't really need to worry about the numbers on the axis. This is just kind of a mean number per survey in different months. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around exactly what that means, but you definitely see that a lot of birds are arriving in late July, and they're peaking in fall, and then they're basically going away. And then, so what you might think is that they're leaving town completely. They're just on their way and they're keeping going further south, but they're not. They're just going into habitats during these winter months that you can't see. They're not on the beach. They're going back into the bays, and you're not seeing them on the beach anymore. And then along this axis here, he's got basically an index that gives you an idea of how they're doing by year, right? You see some variation. You would expect that with data that's pretty variable by year. But I don't have his more recent one, but you do see here, starting in the 90s, kind of this sort of a indication that there might be something going on. They might be starting to decline. So what we did was we were looking at piping plovers and we wanted to know how many there were and how well they were doing, how well they were surviving at different places along the Texas coast. So we did so we looked at 5 sites, and we had data from Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, who had been doing similar studies at Matagorda and Follett's Island up the coast. We've been surveying Mustang and North Padre for all these years. And we're also looking down here at Boca Chica, which is right on the border. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. So as I said, we were counting birds as we went on these surveys. And essentially what we found is what you're doing is you're estimating the number of birds. This is not like a high count of birds that you saw in any given survey. This is a means of using the information from uniquely banded birds and putting it in a model that will estimate how many birds are actually there. You're never going to see them all at the same time. So, but this model basically estimates how many birds there were. So let me move this out of the way. So you see here, this is the number of piping plover on the y-axis. And, you know, we've got pretty good numbers of birds on, this is blue is North Padre, and Mustang is in green. Matagorda, Follett's, we started doing a little bit later. But again, this is the number of piping plovers, doesn't have to do with the distribution, because these surveys are of differing lengths. But what it did tell us is that by just estimating based on these sites, which represent 15% of the beaches, of the Gulf beaches in Texas, we came up with over 1,000 piping plovers. And if that's only 15%, just think how many are out there that we're not really understanding or really out there. So another way of looking at it, this is standardized based on a per kilometer basis. So now you're kind of comparing apples to apples a little bit more. So this is more like what you would consider density. So the highest densities of piping plovers that are being supported are in North Padre and at Matagorda, to some extent on Follett's. But what you'll notice in both of these graphs, because they're standardized, they're basically following the same trajectory, is that these green ones, these Mustang ones, between the winters of 2016 and 2020, are kind of on this fairly consistent decline. You know, say, well, it's only 5 years. We don't really know. Can't really say too much about that, but there's definitely a noticeable decline there. as we were clocking everything and clocking the number of birds, also the number of people and vehicles by kilometer, where we displayed that here. Basically, these are on a per kilometer basis. The higher these bars, the higher the number of piping plovers. Same for this, pedestrians and vehicles, moving this around. And you see how that the number of people and vehicles is not distributed randomly across the beach, and you wouldn't expect that. They go to where the beach access is, or they go where over here where the jetty is, and everybody likes to hang out, or they go, there's this little spike here over at the state park, or sorry, not there. Thinking of one over here at this little pass that people like to hang out at. But you can see here that the densities of plovers, the highest densities are going to be in those areas that are essentially there's less people and vehicles. And you can see this happen if you go to the beach on a busy weekend, that you'll get there. If you get there in the morning, you'll see a good number of birds along the beach, and you'll park, and then someone else will come in and they'll park a little bit further down. Birds are all right. They're moving in between. They're okay. Nobody's left yet. And now a couple more cars come in and they start filling in, and everybody fills in kind of like this and just sort of spreads themselves out over this distance. Well, there gets to be a point where there's not enough room between people, and then someone lets their dog out and it's just kind of all over. So you kind of hit this critical mass of people and vehicles, and these beaches essentially become non-habitat for birds. It's essentially a form of habitat loss. If you're keeping the birds from using it, it's functional habitat loss. I'm going to talk a little bit about Boca Chica. This is kind of a tricky one here. It's a really big complex. This is the Rio Grande River here. So this is the US side and this is Mexico. And this illustrious system of tidal flats here is a really, really unique geological feature. This is South Bay, some of the best fishing, snook fishing, and it's just incredible seagrass meadows down there. And then these are all these tidal flats. And we've known for years that this spot is probably the best spot in all of the range as far as the density of piping plovers that it supports, and hundreds of thousands of other shorebirds. So there's essentially, I forget, something like 11 or 12,000 acres that are protected as part of the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge, and some state park land that's also owned by the state but managed by the refuge. So just a mass of really nice protected land. Except for a couple spots. So there were two small inholdings that were not protected that a gentleman purchased and decided to develop a spaceport. So this is the SpaceX production facility. This resembles in no way what was originally proposed for the area. It's basically fully industrialized this small Loma. There's about 75 acres there, and then another 40 acres right here where they put the launch pad just down the road. And you can see here, this is the Gulf Beach. So it's just right behind the dunes. So this is an actual quote. I'm not making that one up. Basically, not too worried about it. So it's sort of regarding all of that wildlife refuge land that everybody's money has paid to purchase and protect in perpetuity for its wildlife habitat value, is essentially being regarded as a waste place. So so things start happening out there in 2017. They're moving dirt around and stuff, and then by 2018-19 they start really doing a lot of testing, a lot of they're testing engines. They're testing, so that means things are going to fail. When they fail pretty spectacularly. So there are a lot of explosions out there. You may have seen this in the news. This is literally right on the doorstep. This is less than half a mile away. Where all of these piping plovers are, is less than half a mile away from the launch site where they're doing this. And on this occasion in particular, one of my biologists documented 292 piping plovers in one tiny little spot, like a density that nobody's ever seen anywhere else. So, So anyway, like I said, things have changed quite a bit out there, and these are Wilson's plovers actually, and this was in March, right after a pretty bad explosion that sent debris for miles across the refuge and into the tidal flats that these birds use. These birds, like I said, they're Wilson's plovers. They've just gotten back from, they didn't see what all was going on the last 6 months because they've been hanging out in Panama, having a good time. They show up, and this is basically what their habitat looks like. So we were able to model the abundance and survival down there as well. And what we saw was that in 2019 and 2020, and these were the years when all the big explosions were going on, that all the worst of the activity was going on, you saw a noticeable decline in the estimated number of piping plovers using the site. It's not really surprising when you see what's happening out there. They're not going to tolerate that for very long. But the other thing is that they're not going anywhere else, because we were surveying other areas right around there, north and south, or north anyway. And it wasn't like birds were just moving. You hear that a lot. It drives me nuts when people say, birds can just move, they can fly, they can just go somewhere else. It's not the case. Basically, this is functional habitat loss, and it's going to lead to a decline in populations. So these were the survival estimates, this is the apparent annual survival estimate. And here's 0.7, and right around 0.7 or so is generally what you see in a lot of other studies, sometimes a little bit better than that. What's thought necessary to maintain the species, maintain populations at the adult survival level is a little bit higher than that, 0.75 or so. So you see several of these sites are meeting that. And then Mustang that means that the decline in Mustang and the decline associated with these high activity years at SpaceX is associated with survival. It's two ways that a population can increase. One is that birds can stop dying and they just live longer. And the other is that they have more young and they on breeding grounds, and they bring more young back in. So you can have low survival and high recruitment that'll offset it, but there's actually low survival that's driving the declines here. And then for the breeding birds, these Wilsons and snowy plovers nest there as well. And we've seen essentially pretty much an abandonment of the Boca Chica area by snowy plovers almost entirely. These Wilson's plovers here, small number of them, they're basically as far away from the launch site as they can possibly be at this point. So the future is really not looking very bright for those birds there, unfortunately. I really didn't want to end on that. But so I want to talk a little bit about some of the other things we do to try to help. Well, most of the stuff that I've talked about is research. We also do, you got to implement what you've learned from research to try to make things better. So we do, with those plover nesting projects, we do put out symbolic fencing and signage, reminding people about the laws in a lot of cases. Most of these are in city limits. There's a leash law. You can't just let your dogs run off leash. We do what we call opportunistic on-site outreach, which can go one way or another. Usually people are pretty receptive about stuff once you sort of explain to them what's going on. And then we've engaged with the public, getting the university involved in some of these projects, and some of our partners like American Bird Conservancy and Gulf Coast Bird Observatory. We're being consistent across the coast about our messaging and how we go about these things. We're encouraging responsible recreational use. A lot of these are public access sites. They're publicly accessible. They're not private. You can't keep people out of them. They're going to use them. They've got every right to. In this case, we've put up some signs. We were fenced off an area, and we've just said, hey, fishermen, I know you're going from A to B, but would you mind going around here and just sort of taking care of that you don't run over these birds? And compliance has been really good. I'm actually somewhat optimistic about some of these sites where in 2003, I surveyed a lot of the coastal bend region for snowy plovers. I looked everywhere for these birds. I found them, here and there. One place I did not find them was at Charlie's pasture. It was, at the time, it was a wasteland. People were treating it as a wasteland. People were tearing it up. There were burned up vehicles and mattresses and just parties out there every weekend. And it was otherwise great habitat, but it could not be used. Since then, and now the city's got a lease on the property. They're managing it as a nature preserve, and it is really, really a bright spot. So it's been pretty positive. One other thing we did ostensibly to raise awareness for plovers was, and to celebrate the fact that we have the most plovers in North America in our region, was this event called Oktoberfest. And we did this a couple of years ago. It was really, really a neat event. It was at a local brewery, at Lorelei Brewery, and then some artists from the university here, well, at A&M Corpus Christi. Basically, they do this, they've got a lot of students who do like woodblock carving. So they carved all 8 of the plovers that are around here, and we're basically on site and printing t-shirts. Really, really nice, high quality stuff. Really, really unique. And we also thought that would be a good time. I wrote up a plover pledge, and here is Rosalie taking the plover pledge. She's got a beer in one hand. She's got her hand on a copy of the latest Waiter Study Group Bulletin. And my son here is administering the pledge to her. So if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind if you want to take the pledge now. I state your name. There's always going to be one. It's going to say, state your name. Do solemnly swear to not make life more difficult for plovers than they already have it. Not field. Thank you. That was amazing. That was like music to me. I honestly didn't think a lot of people would chime in on that. I know if I did that with a group of kids, they would just be like, but thank you for doing that. Now I can count this many more people and the countless thousands that I'm sure are listening online as having taken the pledge. So I feel like we've really gained some ground tonight. So anyway, I appreciate that. That event was in 2019. We got COVIDed out for a couple of years. We didn't manage to get it put together this last October, but it will be returning next fall. So please just keep an eye out and keep an eye on our website and social media and what have you, and we'll hope to see you then. I just want to acknowledge, I started listing people, and then the list of people got just extremely long. So many people that have helped with all these research projects over the years, that I just focused on some of the main funding entities here that I wanted to acknowledge and thank. So there's two things here. There's acknowledgements, which is one thing, but I want to specifically thank these agencies and organizations. And I'm acknowledging Google, but I'm thanking Google Scholar for the hole that I started going down yesterday morning, and with Google Scholar finally being able to help pull me out of that rabbit hole, or otherwise I'd be swearing to you that this crocodile bird actually existed, did what Herodotus said. Anyway, and I really want to thank or dedicate this to the memory of Tony Amos, who did so much for the area. And then you can find more about us. Here's a couple things you can sort of follow on Facebook. CBBP Coastal Bird Program is the bird program within the estuary program, and this is the main one's Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program. So anyway, I thank you so much for your time and attention and for taking the pledge. I know we can really turn things around for these birds now. Feeling good. So I appreciate your time. And if there's any questions, how you want to handle that? Anybody who I think Adriana's got a mic if you need it. Otherwise, you're welcome to holler something out at me, throw things at me if you like.
There is one question through Zoom.
Okay.
The question is it true that colored bands have affected breeding patterns among populations because the color bands make them more attractive to mates?
Actually, I've done quite a lot of looking into this because of another project, and there's always a concern. Actually, the concern is usually that there would be some sort of a negative consequence, like that there would be, the leg would get in the way or the marker would get in the way. I'm not aware, and there is some evidence to support that. In some cases, there's been some issues, but it's pretty minimal. And as scientists, researchers, obviously you don't want to harm the things more than we want an honest assessment of how these birds are doing. So we're very, very careful about that. As far as any positive effects on becoming more attractive, I'm not aware of that. Maybe that's what they need, some of these poor performing populations.
Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I'd like to know more about the piping plovers in the Great Lakes.
Okay, so like I said, a lot of the piping plovers in the Great Lakes, they winter. They're very, very small population, and they winter from the Western Gulf over to Florida, and actually a good chunk of those, which is not a huge number of birds, but a good chunk of them actually is in the Southeast US, like in South Carolina and Georgia. But there is as I mentioned, there's these different colored leg flags. If it's orange, it's from the Great Lakes. And there's some researchers, Francie Cuthbert, who's with the University of Minnesota, who runs the program up there, all the recovery efforts up there. I don't know about specific locations and things like that. I know they are in Wisconsin. There are some of the dunes, like forget what they're, Sleeping Bear Dunes. I don't know which. Michigan. That's Michigan. Yeah, you guys will know these areas better than I do, but it's just a small number of pairs here and there. There's the ones in Chicago, the famous Montrose, Monty and Rose, the pair. There was a pair of plovers named Monty and Rose that it seems like a miracle, but they nested on Montrose Beach in Chicago. Like, who would have guessed? No, I think they were named that afterwards, but pretty much all of the birds in the Great Lakes are marked. They know where the birds are. They mark every individual one. So they have very, very good data on those birds. I think the trajectory is somewhat increasing over time there, but it's still a really low population. So there's a lot of stewardship that goes into making sure they survive.
So you said you showed downward trends of the plovers in both the SpaceX facility area and also on Mustang Island. Is the Mustang Island downward trend based on the more tourism, or do you have any theories of why there would be a downward trend on Mustang Island?
That's something that we're going to look into more. Like I showed you that there were so what I didn't show, I showed you kind of how birds and people are distributed. And that's kind of over the whole course of the surveys we've done over a number of years. But what we also did with that data is looked at it where we compared essentially we treated every single survey, every kilometer segment individually and looked for correlations with numbers of people and vehicles. And yes, obviously they're highly correlated, but the numbers of over time are indeed increasing. The tourism is increasing. There's, the city of Port-Aransas does do some maintenance and kind of prettying up the beach that may be negatively affecting birds as well. Golf carts are ubiquitous now, and that was something that wasn't going on until fairly recently. And that's just sort of the different thing about golf carts as opposed to vehicles is if you take a vehicle to the beach, you're generally going and you're finding a spot and stopping. You're spending time there. But with golf carts, it's just like, people just sort of joyriding up and down the beach. And it's every time they go past a bird, it's like, I mean, you all have been sitting down during this, right? Just been sitting in one place. Well, how would you like it if somebody just came running at you constantly and you had to get up and go sit in? Like eventually you would just get up and leave, right?
Okay, there is a question from the Zoom. What is your favorite plover?
Oh. That's a tough one. Probably the Wilson's plover. It's the most punchy and charismatic one that I've enjoyed working with, sure. Aside from the Egyptian, the local plovers can be the Wilsons. It depends. So the birds that we're catching on breeding grounds, like the Wilsons and snowy plovers, it is literally no more complicated than you've seen on cartoons. Basically, a netted box propped up with a stick. You hide from the distance and you pull the stick out and catch them that way. But that's only for the ones that are breeding here. For the ones that are wintering here or passing through, what I use most of the time is it's called a cannon net, and it's basically a net that is packed into sort of a box with some big metal projectiles, and there's like black powder charges with an electric match, and we set that off, and it fires over the birds when they're present. So it's a lot of fun.
Okay, one more question before I let you go. Regarding Wilson's plover, what is the reason for tracking them via light versus location?
Yeah, really good question. Ideally, you see with the black-bellied plover, the types of data that you can get from that GPS level data, like GPS level accuracy, and that thing had a little solar panel on it even. So it just means that the battery's not going to just run down and you stop getting data. It's going to be, those things will track birds for several years. Black-bellied plover weighs about 4 times as much as a Wilson's plover. And the technology, I mean, that's really advanced technology, even for to get a light level geolocator small enough for a bird to carry. So when we're doing this is not just, me doing whatever the heck I want. You have to this is all permitted activities, and you have to justify what you're doing, why you're doing it. And the banding lab will set about a 3% body mass threshold. So you can't put anything that weighs more than 3% of basically sort of the fat-free body mass of the bird on them. So the geolocator is the best we could do for a bird of that size.
All right, thank you very much. Another round of applause.
Thank you.